Thank you for sharing the passion of St. John. We walk with Jesus in his suffering, in his death, in his passion. For my homily this evening, I'm using part of a book from Philip Yancey called The Jesus I Never Knew. The Jesus I Never Knew. One of the chapters is about Dr. Paul Brand. He was a specialist in hand and tendons. Upon his arrival at a compound for patients in India, it was a leper colony. The people had Hansen's disease. He quietly slipped in with the group, sitting on a mat behind them. As a hand specialist, his eyes were naturally drawn to the patient's hands, most of which had missing or deformed fingers that were turned in. Hands were often called leper's claws. Most of the patients were sitting on their hands, or they covered their hands, hiding them. They asked him to speak, and he began by saying, "I am a hand surgeon. So when I meet people, I can't help but look at their hands. I can't tell your future like a palm reader, but I can tell your past. I can tell what your trade has been by the position of the calluses and the condition of the nails. I can tell a lot about your character from your hands. I love hands." Then he said, "How I would love to have had a chance to meet Christ and look at his hands." So he talked about the hands of Christ, beginning with infancy, when his hands were small and helpless, tender, the soft hands of a baby. Then came the boy Jesus, playing games, holding a stylus as he learned to write his letters. Then the hands of the carpenter, rough, gnarled, broken fingernails and bruises from working with wood and hammer and saw. But there were also the hands of Christ the healer. They were filled with compassion, sensitivity radiated from them. And when he touched people, they could feel the divine Spirit, the divine healer coming through. Then there were the crucified hands. It hurts me to think of nails being driven through the center of the hand. The hammer missing the nail, breaking fingers and bones. Because I know what goes on there. The tendons and nerves and muscles being injured. The thought of those healing hands being crippled reminds me what Christ was prepared to endure. In that act, he identified himself with all of the deformed and crippled human beings in the world. Not only was he able to endure poverty with the poor, weariness with the tired, but the clawed hands of the crippled. Now the people in the leper colony were blown away by this idea. A cripple with claw hands like theirs, Christ. And then there were the resurrected hands. One of the astonishing things is that when Christ appeared to his disciples, what did he say? Come look at my hands. They were not washed clean. They were not pure and perfect. Christ's resurrected hands had holes from the nails and broken fingers from the hammer. Even in the resurrection, he carried the nail marks and crushed fingers of suffering so he could continue to understand the needs of the suffering. He wanted to be forever one with us, forever with us. And as he finished, Dr. Brand looked around and saw the patient's hands. Now were not hidden, now were not covered, but they lifted them up, palm to palm, in an Indian gesture of respect. The hands were the same stumps, the same missing fingers and crooked claws, but people weren't hiding them anymore. They were held high, close to their faces, and a new pride and dignity came upon them. So think about your own life and maybe your own hands. Haven't there been many times of transition or when things seem to have been falling apart? A job loss, an illness or injury, the end of a relationship, maybe a natural disaster affecting your family, or even an act of violence you endured. Maybe at that time, God might have seemed far away. And yet, how many times when you look back on your life can you recognize God's hands, God's fingerprints, as He was guiding and shaping new possibilities and a future that you most likely hadn't imagined? This was Jesus' mission. Jesus came so that He could be lifted up to God with His people. This is why it was so important for Dr. Brand to go beyond the marred and mangled hands of the crucified Christ to remind suffering women and men of how God used the wounds of Christ, used those wounds, the nail marks of suffering, as a way to show us to true glory. The divine gift of life and grace that has the power to conquer death and transform the darkness of grief, destruction, decay, and death, and change it into heaven's light. Good Friday reminds us that just as Christ suffered a cruel and bloody death on the cross, that God has hidden the seed of divine life, and that seed of life is hidden in our own experiences of suffering. The seed of divine life is in our experiences of suffering. So we have hope in these holy days as we walk with Christ. We know that there is more to life, and we are being invited to watch and wait, trusting that the wood of the tree of the cross will bear the fruit of life and light, heaven's light, not just for us, but for the salvation of the world.